prepared to do both, but
Maybe there's more than one of you.
yeah, I would like to be able to multiply myself sometimes, but day in the life of the rabbi.
Right.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Great, thank you. I thought we'd start with some music to get us situated. A song for peace, Shir LaShalom. Tnu LaShemesh Lalot LaBoker LeHa'ir Hazaka shebatfilot Otanu lo tachzir Mi asher kavan eron Uve'afanit man Bechima lo yairo Lo yachziro lechan Ishotanu lo yashir Mibor tachti tafel Kalo yo'ilu lo shirei hanetzachon Velo shirei hallel. Here we go. Al ken rak shiro shir shalom Al tilchashu tefila Mutav tashiro shir shalom Betzeach hagdola Tnu LaShemesh lachador מבעד לפרחים אל תביטו לאחור הניחו להולכים שאו עיניים בתקווה לא דרך כוונות שירו שיר לאהבה ולא למלחמות אל תגידו לא יבוא הביאו את היום כי לא חלום הוא וכל הכיכרות הריעו לשלום על כן רק שירו שיר לשלום אל תלחשו תפילה מוטב תשירו שיר לשלום בצעק הגדולה. Okay, so it is my honor to present someone you all know, Rabbi Brown, to speak. But really, we are so lucky and appreciative to have someone who is such a knowledgeable scholar on this topic and can guide us through unpacking Zionism. Come on up.
Hi, everyone. Great to be together in such a friendly crowd. So first of all, I just want to thank Cantor Cohen for bringing Shir Sholom, not only because it's good to sing of peace, but just to remind us, of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, we just a few weeks ago commemorated the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. That was the song that was sung in the square the night of that horrible event. And in fact, many of you probably remember that it was folded in his coat and that it had blood on it. And just that notion of, the yearning for peace and the difficulty to find peace and the struggle for it, it all comes together, certainly 30 years ago today. And as we'll see here, 200 years ago as well. So Cantor Cohen asked me, a couple months ago, she said that there was a request from this group to do some learning, a presentation about Zionism, but particularly about kind of the era leading up to the founding of the state. I think that, for many of us, when we think about Israel's history, some of us go way back to biblical times. We think about, Abraham, we think about King David, we think about the temples standing in Jerusalem. And many of us also think about kind of 1948 and forward. And it's the middle that some of us are missing. And I would say, myself included, this is not the era that I would call myself an expert in, but I've done a lot of reading, and I find it very, very interesting to explore. I think that understanding that middle, and particularly the few, I would say decades leading up to the founding of the State of Israel, really puts into context what it means to have a Jewish state. It puts into context who are the Israelis, who are the Palestinians. It puts into context, all of these questions about the tensions between, the different residents of this land and how we got here. So I'm not going to solve the conflict. But I hope that, in this time together this afternoon, that maybe we can understand it a little bit better and have a good sense of how we got here. So I feel like my husband with a PowerPoint. This is good. Okay. So the Ottoman Empire, it was long and it was big. I mean, you can just see on this map how much territory was part of the Ottoman Empire. It, of course, started in Turkey. You can see kind of the dark brown in the middle, but it expanded and expanded and expanded. And in the green area, which is where we have the land of Israel, it was in 1517, actually, that the Ottomans entered the land of Israel. Before they were there, the Mamluks were kind of the reigning empire of the land of Israel, and they were Egyptian-based, but the Ottomans really started to conquer and expand and expand and expand. And we really have a very strong influence in the land of Israel, in particular in Jerusalem, of the Ottomans. And so you'll see things that you recognize very clearly. And a lot of that had to do with Suleiman the Magnificent, who was the Ottoman Sultan between 1520 and 1566. So that was a pretty long period, and he administered over 25 million people. Okay, so this was a big job he had, but he really left this lasting impact in the architecture of Jerusalem. And when we think about, if we just close our eyes and imagine, the old city, and especially the external walls of the old city, that's all Ottoman era construction, and he did that. So, the gates, there were gates there before, but they weren't this grand. If you can see the picture in the lower right, the Zion gate, that shows the gate, but also the ramparts that are all across the top, which, by the way, is my favorite activity to do in Jerusalem, is to walk the ramparts. You can go, you pay a few shekels, and you can walk all along the perimeter of the whole city. It's really neat. And he also was the one who tiled the Dome of the Rock. So the way that we see the Dome of the Rock with these beautiful, colorful tiles, that all came from him. He did a lot. And like, many different empires in the world, when they came, they did big, grand things, and life was pretty good. Like, it was, things were okay. Now, when the Ottoman Empire began its reign, at that time there were about 1,000 Jewish families living in the land of Israel. And they were mostly in the old walled cities, because that's where people lived. So we have Jerusalem, Nablus, Hebron, Gaza, Safed, and in the Galilee as well. So these were, really long-standing Jewish settlement. Some of them were descendants of Jews who had never left the land of Israel. There had been continuous, settlement and Jews living in the land of Israel forever, since there were Jews in biblical times. But there were also a number of immigrants from North Africa and Europe who found home in these cities over the different centuries. And in fact, the Ottoman conquest of all of this territory was really good for the Jews. If you kind of remember your history, so we're talking about, the early 1500s, what happened at the end of the 1400s? You guys are good. Expulsion from Spain and Portugal. So all of the Sephardic Jews who were living in Spain and Portugal were expelled. The ones who survived and were able to go to other places, they actually found refuge in the Ottoman Empire and moved all over that empire. And some of those Jews kind of in that time decided to move to the land of Israel as one of those places of refuge. So that's who we have living here. One of kind of the most well-known communities in the land of Israel that developed in this time was in Sfat. So this is in northern Israel. And if you are, how many of you have been to Sfat before? Wow, okay. So you'll recognize the blue, right? That's a very emblematic part of Sfat is the painting of doors and stairways in blue, as kind of to ward off the evil eye. But it was really in this time as well where we had the Kabbalists, the Jewish mystics who really found this kind of developed this center of Jewish life. And all this kind of intellectual and spiritual activity. This is where we get Kabbalat Shabbat. The Friday night service was from Tzfat, from these rabbis who would go out into the hills to welcome Shabbat as the sun set on Fridays. The Shulchan Aruch, that really well-known code of Jewish law, developed in Tzfat in this time. And it became really like one of the hubs of kind of the Jewish intellectual world in Sfat. So at this point, there are about 10,000 Jews living in Sfat. So it's, quite a big expansion of the Jewish population of the time. So a little bit just about the Jews who lived in the land of Israel as we kind of continue between like the 17th and 19th centuries. So we call this period of like the dwelling of Jews in the land of Israel the Old Yishuv. So Yishuv just means kind of the dwelling place. But these were the Jews who were primarily living in the land of Israel. It's actually kind of amazing that we have photographs from this era. I mean, this is getting into the late 1800s, but we can really kind of see, as we think about who they were, kind of how they look like. What do you see here? Okay, so we've got the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, and yes, there are women there. So this wasn't, in this period, it wasn't treated as like a synagogue as it is today. And so, there was no mechitza. That's actually going to come up a little bit later. There's no mechitza. There's no, prayer books and Torah scrolls or anything like that. It was just a place to go and to pray. And so it was mixed. It was not separated by gender. And it's a little hard to see here, but if you could imagine on this edge, like there's actually another wall there. So it was actually very narrow, almost like an alley where you would go. What else do you notice about these Jews here? What do you see in their appearance? They look a little Muslim looking. They look a little Arab, right? That's just the fashion of the time and the place, right? Everyone kind of looked the same. People generally dressed the same. What else do you see? How do they look? Hard to see. Yeah, Bella. Yeah, the women are covered, right? They've got kind of head coverings on. They were really poor, right? These were poor people. They were primarily people who were living here were, religious people, poor people who relied on donations for support. There were a number of people who were moving to the land of Israel at this time, but not for like some Zionist ideological principle. It was for religious reasons, but also because a lot of people who were moving were old and they wanted to end their lives in the land of Israel and be buried there. And so you had a lot of people who really, were not able to work. The country as a whole, like this whole area was, known to be kind of a little bit economically depressed and politically unstable in this era. And people really just couldn't support themselves. And so there were overseas collections from other Jewish communities to help support the Jews living in the old Yishuv. And in particular in Jerusalem. That was a big thing that people would go and collect money for them. So it was right kind of at the end of this time, the end of the 19th century, the late 1880s, that we start to see a bit of a change and the movement of Jews who now are wanting to live in the land of Israel for reasons beyond religious reasons. And the beginnings of what we see as Zionism, as this desire to live as a sense of kind of a place of a national home where Jews can live freely and have self-determination. Now, many of us, when we learn about Zionism, this is kind of where we start, is the Dreyfus Affair. So this was a scandal that happened in 1894. Dreyfus was a French army captain who was arrested and falsely accused of spying, and he was convicted in a military court for selling military secrets to the Germans. And he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And it became this big scandal because he didn't do it, right? And it was very much like an anti-Semitic scapegoating. We have this famous front page of Émile Zola, J'accuse, he was arguing that the government had conspired against Dreyfus on false grounds, and it was a big scandal, not just in France, but among Jews around the world. That France was supposed to be this cradle of, liberté, fraternité, égalité. I'm not don't speak égalité, whatever. I'm such a bad Canadian, I know. And this idea that all of the kind of enlightenment that happened in France was not actually going to be a defense against anti-Semitism. And it was this scandal of the Dreyfus Affair that really caught the attention of Theodor Herzl, who was a young reporter, a journalist from Vienna, and it changed him. He had been highly assimilated Viennese, and suddenly he realized, this was not a problem that was going to go away, and that there needed to be another solution, which was Jewish nationalism in Zionism. So yes, in many ways, this is the birth of political Zionism, but we also have other forms of Zionism besides the religious going to, go dwell in the land of Israel, that were brewing a little before Herzl, a little before the Dreyfus Affair, particularly in Eastern Europe, where we had the Haskalah, the Enlightenment going on there, which wasn't really about emancipation for Jews, but about thinking about Judaism and Jewish identity in different ways, not limited to a yeshiva and sitting with a page of Gemara, but thinking about poetry and thinking about Hebrew language and thinking about, working the land, and again, this notion of self-determination. So what we start to see is the idea of broadening the scope of the places where Jews in the Yishuv would be living in the land of Israel. Not anymore just these small enclaves in particularly walled cities, Jerusalem, Hebron, Tzfat, etc., but to create settlements outside. The first one of these is the big one in the middle, Mishkanot Sha'ananim. Does anyone recognize that, know where it is? Jerusalem. Yeah, Jerusalem. So this neighborhood is just outside of the old city. It's known mostly by the name Yamin Moshe today. Moshe, or Moses, was Moses Montefiore, who was an important philanthropist, a British philanthropist, who wanted to be able to support the Jews. Like I said, there were all these Jews from around the world who were supporting these Jews living in the old city of Jerusalem, but it was not great. I mean, it was so crowded and dirty, and there was lots of sickness and things like that, so he decided to help found a settlement outside of the city walls, and to build a windmill, of course, which is its very prominent characteristic today. And this was done by just purchasing land, right? So these were four, residents of the Ottoman Empire who were living in the land to be able to purchase land to expand where they might be living. That wasn't met with a lot of support by the Ottomans. Now, what do I mean by the Ottomans? Well, by kind of the ruling Ottomans, they did not want to sell land to the Jews. Why? Well, because it was right around this time that the Ottoman Empire that we saw get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger was starting to close in, right, and fall. Not completely fall yet, but getting close. And we see kind of the Austria-Hungarian Empire gaining a lot of strength and basically taking over territory. And now we've got these, in addition to the people coming out of the old city to live in the land of Israel, we start to have the Jews of Eastern Europe, these Haskalah Enlightenment Jews who are falling in love with the idea of being able to reclaim Jewish nationalism, are starting to come to purchase land, and they want to restrict this. They're very worried about what might happen if there is a flood of Jews, and they were particularly worried about Russians, because of the connections with kind of what was happening with Russia and other places in the Ottoman Empire, of their decreasing territory. For the first half of the 19th century, it was actually official policy that no one who was a foreigner could purchase land anywhere in the Ottoman Empire, period. But then it switched. And in 1881, they said that foreign Jews could immigrate and settle anywhere in the Ottoman Empire except for Palestine. Okay, couldn't do it there. And that was the law on the books from 1881 until the Ottomans formally fell in 1918, that they restricted Jewish immigration and land purchase. The other thing is that though it was on the books that you couldn't sell to Jews, the landowners were selling to Jews. They were able to do that as kind of private entities, and a lot of the land in the land of Israel at this time was actually owned by absentee Arab landowners. Okay? So there were local Arabs living on the land, working the land, often actually very poor, and being able to work like a small plot of land. But the people who owned the land were not living there, and they were happy to sell it to the Jews. And so this was happening, and there were these transfers of land. So you can see some of these early settlements that were the kind of the first purchases of land outside of these traditional cities. Rosh Pina, again Mishkanot Sha'ananim in Jerusalem, Rishon LeZion. These are all happening in the 1880s. The Jerusalem one was the first one in 1860. The other thing that we start to see in the Ottoman Empire around this time is a rising anti-Semitism. Before this time, as I mentioned, there was actually pretty good relationships among Jews and their Muslim neighbors in most of the Ottoman Empire. But we start to see this happening. And again, this shouldn't be surprising when we think about like how anti-Semitism works. Usually anti-Semitism operates as sort of a blaming mechanism for when a community needs a scapegoat for their troubles. And as the empire is shrinking and the Austrian Empire is chipping away at them, we start to have local leaders who are stoking the resentments of the time against the local Jews. So the most famous example of this is Damascus. There was the Damascus blood libel in 1840. And it's interesting what happened there. So at that time, actually, the Syrians kind of were in charge of that part of the Ottoman Empire. Excuse me, I take that back. It was in Syria, but the Egyptians were actually in charge of that part of the empire. And the Ottomans, actually, when it happened, they tried to stop it. They tried to really put a stop to it. And they actually formally declared the Jews in Syria to be equal subjects under the law. But there was so much poverty and violence and anger that the Jews continued to be targets. So sometimes it's like there's official policies that tend to trickle down into the population, and sometimes there's resentments in the population that can't kind of stem the tide of anger even when the official government is trying to stop it. So now we have the development of kind of the new Yishuv. Okay, so again, we're no longer just thinking about the land of Israel, with these ancient cities and just a couple of tiny settlements, but now we're getting more and more of these settlements. And the new Yishuv are the Jews who are not thinking of themselves as the poor Jews who need to be supported by the tzedakah of people coming from elsewhere, but actually they're going to, till the land and build it themselves and drain the swamps and all these things. So we start to get kind of really this is the beginnings of kind of what we would call kind of the formal period of aliyot, of these kind of immigration, Zionist immigration to Israel, and they're there's a bunch of them. We're going to talk about a couple of them here. Often they're known as like Aliyah Aleph, Aliyah Bet. The first Aliyah Aleph is the first Aliyah. This is between 1882 and 1903. And this is where we start to get kind of the first Hebrew settlements. These are not kibbutzim yet, but these are settlements kind of to create small villages and towns. There are 32 of these colonies that are created during this time. We have some, very well-known ones like Rishon LeZion, Zichron Yaakov, Rosh Pina, Petach Tikva, the settlements that take place in this first Aliyah, they were really incredible. But some of them really were helped along still by kind of the philanthropy outside. So even though they didn't want the help, they got the help. So, for example, Zichron Yaakov, does anybody know who helped to pay for Zichron Yaakov? Rothschild, very good, Baron Rothschild. And actually it became an important a wine production that happens, and still to this day there's the winery is there. And the people who came in the first yeshuv, they were tough. This was really creating something from nothing. The land was very, very difficult. This is where we start to get this archetype of the new Jew, right? It's the new yeshuv, it's the new Jew, the muscular, strong farmer, it was a big time. Now, there were about 25,000 people who came in the first Aliyah, and people say, though, that about half of them left. Right? It was hard. Where did they come from? Most of the first Aliyah came from Eastern Europe, primarily Russia. There was a section of the first Aliyah that came from Yemen, but most of them were from Eastern Europe. But it was a really hard life, and many who came said, that was an interesting adventure, I'm going back. You can see in these photos, like there's nothing there. It's really barren. So shortly after this, we start to get towards the second Aliyah. So this is now, we're at the very beginning of the 20th century, 1904 to 1913. And this was a much more consequential wave of immigration in the sense of more of those who came stayed. It's estimated about 40,000 Jews came in the second Aliyah. Those who stayed really became the leaders of the yeshuv. And here I'm kind of want to draw your attention to this term yeshuv turns from just being kind of the community of Jews that dwell there to the organized community of Jews. So we're starting to get, with this wave of immigration, the beginnings of the institutions that would really transform the Jewish community in Israel to kind of pre-state institutions, and then eventually into the formal government institutions of the state of Israel. But a lot of the second Aliyah were more kind of intellectual, like very ideologically minded Jews who really wanted to make this happen. Very influenced. Now this is post-Dreyfus. This is happening really as there's a sense among many Jews, not all the Jews, but many Jews, that the future of the Jewish people can only be in a place in which the Jewish people can have self-determination. And there's also a blending of socialism, which was in the air at the same time, into using socialism as a way to with hard work, to make the land blossom and the community grow. And so this is where we start to get the kibbutzim, the beginnings of the kibbutzim, and you can see the pioneers on the right side, ready and working hard and really young. And they were so young. A lot of them were late teens, early 20s, coming and just ready to work the land. Wendy.
Were they from Russia and inspired by the early days of the communist regime, talking about working the land and all that stuff?
Yeah, there was certainly a lot of influence there of what was going on in Russia. They were, adapting that to a Zionist, a Jewish lens. But we also have, it's not exclusively Eastern Europe anymore. We have a lot more of Western Europe, for example. The people who were living, in the time of the Dreyfus Affair, right, who recognized that this was, really that there might not actually be a viable future for Jews in Europe. And this was a tension, among Jewish communities all over the world there were those who were Zionists, there were those who were non-Zionists, there were those who were anti-Zionists. Sound familiar? I mean, this was, kind of going on all the time. It was very much part of the active Jewish culture of these places, and not just, for the second Aliyah, I would say from here all the way up to the Holocaust, of Zionist youth clubs and debates and things like this. Was really an active conversation that was going on. Violetta.
The Ottoman Empire, and talked about occupation.
So, we're about to get there. But just as a reminder, though, like they're not happy with all of the Jews that are purchasing land, right? They're starting to get nervous about what that means for the kind of both the kind of flavor of the empire and the kind of the political stability of the populations, right? That they're worried about having too many Jews living side by side with the Arabs. Yeah.
You relate this to the background of what people are today known as Palestinians?
So the people who are the Arabs living in the land of Israel, so the Ottoman Empire, they called this area, it was just the whole Ottoman Empire, it was Ottoman territory, but it was known by the name Palestine. Palestine actually is a term that came from the Romans. So this is really old, that the Romans called it when they exiled all the Jews from Jerusalem. And so it was known as Palestine. The people, both the Jews, the Arabs, everyone who was living there in kind of Ottoman Palestine, they were Palestinians. It was like just whoever lived there, that was the nationality. But people also were known by their kind of ethnic identity, which would have been Arab, Jew. It was mostly a Christian, I guess. So Palestinian as an identity, it was more of almost like a citizenship rather than a national identity, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I heard that it meant Philistine, the PH, that it was the Romans' idea that the Jews were such troublemakers. They made so much service for the Romans a couple times, so they wanted to erase them from history. So they called them the Philistines, which was known from biblical.
Right, the biblical Philistines. Yeah. Okay. All right. So as World War I was happening, that was the end, of course, of the Ottoman Empire. But the war, before it formally ended and the empire, officially ended, which was 1918, there was already talk among a lot of the European governments about what would this land look like after the war. They knew the Ottoman Empire was going to fall. Who was going to have control of this territory? And so there was actually a secret treaty that was made between the British and the French. Okay, and Russia was involved. Like, there was a lot of people, there was something going on outside of everyone's knowledge, which was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916. And this was the way to divide up much, not all, but much of what had been the Ottoman Empire. Yes? Correct, yes. Yeah, I'll repeat what Arthur said for those who couldn't hear, that the Ottomans allied themselves with the Germans in World War I, which is why the British and the French and the Russians would have been making this kind of deal together, and they weren't with. So just in case you can't see what all these colors are, I'll point out. Iraq at the bottom would be British. The kind of dark purple, that's like in Turkey, Lebanon area, would be French, and Armenia in the orange would be Russian. And you can see the red, labeled as Palestine, was going to be under British, French, and Russian protection. Sounds messy. Yes? Right, so at this point, they're not countries, right? Lebanon and Jordan are not countries. They're just part of the Ottoman Empire. On the map, so this, on the coast, that would be Lebanon, and then Jordan is here. So just part of Iraq, okay. So like they're kind of, and I mean, Kuwait, you can see on the far right, I mean, that's enormous. Like, that's not how big Kuwait is anymore. So we see how borders and boundaries, they're not something that's always been there, right? And especially in the 20th century, these things are very fluid. They're changing all the time. And there's lots of different players who are kind of making these decisions who are people who don't live there. Okay. So the war is about to end, and one of the most significant things that, even though this is, decided that Palestine will be shared by these three different powers, the British start to step in and take some authority. And one of the most famous, you probably are familiar with this, is the Balfour Declaration, 1917. So Balfour, who was, an important man a minister in the British government, he is friends with Rothschild, and this is as Zionism as a political movement is really looking to gain legitimacy among the nations of the world. And so a lot of, especially British Jews who had good, strong connections with the government are working and lobbying and trying to have them see why Zionism and the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people is really important and in the interests of the British government. And Balfour writes this letter to Rothschild with an official statement from the British government. And I'm just going to read it to you. November 2nd, 1917, Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which have been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours sincerely, Arthur James Balfour. What are the Brits saying? Thank you. Very good. Okay, so Chaim Weizmann was a chemist. So the Weizmann Institute in Israel, which is one of the leading scientific universities in the world, he helped the Brits with their weaponry in World War I to win the war. And so a lot of this is actually gratitude to Weizmann, who was a very strong Zionist, for that help and saying, yes, we agree with you on the importance of having a Jewish national homeland. What else does it say or not say there? Yeah, Violetta.
Not say that Palestine is the ancestral home of the Jews.
Okay, so there's no kind of like saying this is your people's homeland.
Going back to where you came from.
Right. But just that this parcel of land, that will be your, and it's interesting what he says though. He says a national home, which is not a state, right? And that was very deliberate not to use quite that language. So it's like you have national aspirations, you have a home where you can live, but we're not quite ready to give you a formal country. Brigitte.
They're saying that they are declaring sympathy, which is very vague.
Okay, so sympathy is nice, but it's not very binding, right? So we have sympathy with you, and and it's kind of, like this is in a letter, which it says it's voted on by the cabinet, but like, it's a little bit like, here we're sending this to you, we're not putting this on the BBC necessarily quite yet, okay? Yeah, Barbara. Yeah, it's like a little bit of like a nice back rub but like it doesn't hold much. Bella.
If I understand it, the British, as usual, they had another idea, that they wanted to be in that territory because of the oil. The oil is very important to the French, to the British, and to everybody. And I think the oil was one of the things. And the cover that the British wanted a presence in that area.
So the British, I would say the oil, right, in Iraq, there's oil. Right. And in Syria, there's other places where they're dividing up oil, but Israel and Palestine, there's not really oil there. Though, some people say too that and if you can imagine this just from, like, I don't know, like, what's the movie? Lawrence of Arabia or something like there's a very romantic sort of notion of the Holy Land and, going on these explorations. And there's all this, like, in the British period, all these centers for archaeology and, like this, it's, they want the land, I think, also for sentimental and ideological reasons too that are not just about mining for resources. Yeah. So, but the British do that, and they play both sides. They do it with the Arabs too, which we'll see. nationalism was everywhere. It was the cause du jour. Everyone wanted their national thing, yeah. Yeah, we'll get to those both sides in a second. I saw Linda next, yeah.
I was going to say, Balfour is very clever. He says, he tells you you can't, you've got to be careful because there's other people living there, but you're going to be able to do something. And then he doesn't have to put his feet in the thing anymore. It's done. It's done. And you'll be, they're clever, the Jews. They'll be able to figure it out.
Yeah. Norman and Barry.
But Jews only have rights and political status in other countries. You see, it's not acknowledging that they have any special rights in Palestine. But now
Yes, the British are sympathetic for this desire, and I think like it is the first time where there is an acknowledgement by another or a kind of global superpower of kind of the Jewish right to self-determination, right? That's what this Balfour Declaration is really significant for. Though it has not a lot of teeth, it does put this out there into kind of the global market in a really significant and important way. Okay, Barry, Violetta, then we're going to move on. Yeah.
Back here, we can't hear much of what the speaker, the audience members are saying. Could you share the essence of it when you respond, please?
I will do. Thank you for the reminder. Yeah, Violetta.
From a legal point of view, I see something missing there. There is no title for Mr. Balfour, and he's speaking on behalf of the Majesty government. There should be a signature from the Majesty government as well.
Well, you're right? So he's speaking, he's sharing the results of this kind of, vote but he's writing as like your friend Arthur, right? He's kind of, just being a little bit not quite official. This is not coming on this. Right, you want the royal seal. Okay. Yeah. Okay. 10 minutes? Oh my goodness. Okay, we're zooming along. Okay, so the war ends, and there is this conference, the San Remo Conference in 1920, and this is in Italy, and that was actually, at this point, this is when the British were officially given the mandate for Palestine. So no longer is it going to be this shared three-part dreamy place, but it's going to be a British territory. And in fact, it starts, the first kind of discussions for San Remo are that this entire section of what's now Israel and Jordan would be Palestine, that would be one huge piece of land. But then eventually when we get to the League of Nations and their actual official demarcation of the mandate, they separate these two. They're still both British holdings, but there's British Mandate Palestine and then British Mandate Transjordan. So this is when we start to kind of really get these boundaries that are starting to become familiar for the beginnings of the state. What's interesting, and this is, I think, especially with the language of today, we hear a lot about colonization, right? That's like the big trigger word that we hear all the time. All these countries are colonizing these territories. This is what's happening across the world. Though it was very much the way of of the Brits and the French and the Italians, etc., there was already an understanding that to just like conquer and colonize was not going to be something that could be sustainable. And especially with the nationalism that was in the air at the time, that self-determination would be kind of the way of the future, and not just for the Jews, but for all of these different groups living in these lands. And what starts to happen is that the Jews and the Arabs know this. And now we start to get a fight over the attention of the British to be able to determine who is going to win in the end, who is going to be able to have self-determination over this land when the British will eventually leave. So again, the British, even at this point where they start the British Mandate, there's a sense that they know that they're not going to stay there long term. Okay. And what happens over the next decades? This is where we start to see the British play Jews and Arabs against each other, right? This goes back and forth, making contradictory promises to each other. So as this is going on, we start to see violence. Violence of Arabs against Jews, violence of Arabs against the British, violence of Jews against the British. We start to see a lot of violence starting to happen. And one of the most significant moments that's important to understand for this time period is in 1929, which is the Hebron massacre. So in the 1920s, we start to see a rise of all these violent protests and riots. And in this Hebron massacre in 1929, in Hebron, there were 67 Jews that were slaughtered. And many say that this was actually like the true beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That this is where we start to see violence, not just kind of one person here, one person there, but like an actual organized sort of massacre. So to understand what happened in Hebron, we actually have to reverse to Jerusalem just a little bit before to know what was happening there. So in Jerusalem, the British had appointed someone named Haj Amin al-Husseini as the Mufti of Jerusalem. So this was kind of like the chief kind of religious figure, but also a political figure, almost like the Arab mayor of Jerusalem. And he was in charge of managing the holy sites in Jerusalem. And on Yom Kippur, the year before, in 1928, the Jews, remember who we saw before in that little small alleyway, decided that they were going to put up a mechitza and pray at the Kotel on Yom Kippur as it was like a synagogue. And he was not happy with this, the Mufti. But the British said it's allowed. It's allowed that everyone can have their rights, like we heard in the Balfour Declaration. And so he started to do things as they continued to pray going forward to like interrupt the prayer. This actually reminds me of the Women of the Wall. He would like bring in construction and play noise and do all sorts of stuff to make it uncomfortable and disrupt the prayer. And there started to be rumors and propaganda that started to spread that the Jews were attempting to take control of the Temple Mount. And there were fake pictures, like this is fake news. This is, not different than today also, of damage to the Dome of the Rock done by the Jews. And it riled up and incited the population. And there was on Tisha B'Av, there was a group of Jews who gathered to pray. And the next day, a mob stormed the Kotel and destroyed the Sidurim and the prayer books and things that were there. And the next day, they went to Hebron, and there was this massacre. And in Hebron, this was still even though it was 1929, it was still kind of an old yeshuv sort of place, right? Most of the Jews living in Hebron either were Jews who had lived there for, centuries, or descendants, for centuries. There were also, there was a small Ashkenazi yeshiva there as well. So there was a bit of a mixed Jewish community, but it was only about 600 Jews in Hebron and in a population of 20,000. So a very small Jewish community. And the Haganah, who was the defense forces for the Jews at the time, actually had been offering them protection, and they rejected it. They said, we live peaceably among our neighbors, we don't need it. So the mob came and slaughtered these 67 Jews. It was men, women, children, and very, very violent. And a lot of people actually, just as an aside, in the wake of October 7th, said that October 7th was, people kept saying it's like a pogrom, and it was a little bit, but it was like very reminiscent of the Hebron massacre at a bigger scale, of course. Now, what's interesting is that there were many Arab neighbors who actually opened their homes to protect the Jews against the mob. It says that 300 of the Jews of Hebron survived, hiding with their Arab neighbors. But the violence of that day was really a shock to the whole Jewish world, but certainly to those living in the land of Israel, and it put a big damper on kind of Jewish coexistence. And this idea of kind of, these were all different ethnic groups living together, in, like we were talking about, in the early Ottoman period. Now it was, we can't trust our neighbors. And this really was a big shift. And it was also what led to a major increase in kind of the development of the Haganah, of the defense forces, this idea that the Jewish people couldn't be left defenseless, that this was really, really important. Okay. So we start to see an uprising against the British mandate among the local Arab populations. There's a period of, especially, it started in 1936, but for a few years, 36 to 39, where there are all of these kind of violent rebellions. It started actually with a general strike that was called by the Arab Higher Committee. And this revolt was to demand Palestinian independence and an end to Jewish immigration. And the British, repressed the revolt and were able to kind of quiet things down. But meanwhile, as all this is happening, the aliyot continue. So now the Jewish population is about 30% of the population of the territory, of the mandate, and there are all of these kind of proto-governmental institutions that have been established. The kind of Jewish agency led by Ben Gurion, the Haganah, I mentioned the military, the universities, the Histadrut, the labor union, all these things start to develop. Okay, so the British now realize they've got a problem, right? They are managing a territory where there is just so much tension and friction, there is a commission by Lord Peel in 1937 that says, okay, these two people, they can't live together anymore. We're going to divide the territory. And so this was what Peel decided to do, that the blue part in the north would be the Jewish territory, the reddish pink in the bottom would be the Arab territory, and the yellow in the middle would be kind of like an international zone that the British would continue to control. Interestingly, both Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Okay, this left the blue territory, only 17% of the land would be Jewish, I don't have it here, I think it was maybe 44% Arab. So how did people respond? The Jews were reluctant, like 17%, that wasn't such a great number, especially with 30% of the population, but they agreed, though they planned to negotiate, because Jewish, negotiate. But the Arabs rejected the proposal, and they relaunched an armed revolt. So those kind of the revolts that we saw earlier come back again, and they kill in these revolts 500 Jews and 250 British servicemen. So the British are mad, and they respond with force, and they actually killed 5,000 Palestinian Arabs and exile many of their leaders. So it's like, this is not going to be okay, and it's like really looking terrible for the Arabs. Okay, what's about to happen? Second World War. Okay, and guess what? Well, more Jews want to come, but the British now are very concerned about the Arabs, not just the Palestinian Arabs, but the whole Arab world. They're looking out for their own interests, and they need Arab support. Okay? So suddenly the tone changes, and they issue a white paper. And the white paper of 1939, basically it ends the Balfour Declaration's support for a Jewish homeland and drastically limits the number of Jewish immigrants allowed to come, which is horrible, as the Holocaust is about to take place, and there's going to be millions of Jews trying to escape. So, and you can see there's a demonstration here against the white paper in Jerusalem. On the far side is a picture from England, I think from London. You must save the lives of the Jewish people in Germany. Sign the petition to British government for increased immigration to Palestine. So recognizing, this is urgent and needed. And there's a famous line from Ben Gurion, who declares, as the war starts, that he's basically, they're urging young Jews to join the British Army to fight against the Nazis. And Ben Gurion says, "We must help the British Army as if there were no white paper, and we must fight the white paper as if there were no war." Okay. So, everyone is caught in this bind. Now, I just want to go back to our not such a good friend, Haj Amin al-Husseini, again, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who you might know. So he became BFF with the Nazis. He who incited this riot in Hebron, he believed that the Germans would be some more supportive of Arab independence if they formed ties with the Nazis. So everyone's playing each other. You see how this is going. And he went to Berlin in 1941. He toured the camps. He met Hitler. And he would actually assist the Nazis with their radio propaganda in Arabic. He would recruit Muslim soldiers for units in the SS. So this was not, obviously terrible for the Jewish people. Also, the British were really upset because they had recruited him, and now he's siding with the Nazis to fight against the British, and that was not great. Okay, a couple more things. Sorry, how are we doing it? Okay. All right. So in 1944, as all this is going on, we've got the Holocaust happening in Europe. We have, all of this, internal strife going on, Jews versus Arabs versus the British, and the Jews start to get really upset at the British because they're not allowing Jews to come to Palestine, right? All of their brethren are not allowed to come. They're creating the state for Jewish self-determination and safety, and Jews are needing to come, and they can't. So the different Jewish military organizations start a revolt. Now, there was the Haganah, which was the kind of the main central defense organization, but there were a couple of smaller militant groups who were, more, I would say, militant, more aggressive. So the most well-known was the Irgun, and then there was even a break-off group, the Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang. They basically the Irgun and the Lehi, they kind of defied. The Haganah was saying like not to attack the British directly, but they were going after them and committing, these acts of violence. And for a while, actually, because it got so bad, the Haganah actually did join them and were attacking the British. They were like bombing bridges and railroads and things like that. But it all kind of changed in 1946. You probably recognize this photo of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem was bombed by the Irgun, and 91 people were killed. This was the British headquarters. And the Haganah said, that's, no, we don't do that. Yeah, Sunny.
So my understanding is they did try and warn people to give them time to get out of the hotel if something went wrong.
Yeah, so there was discussion. I've read that as well, that there was an attempt to warn them, and it didn't happen. You can see this wanted poster, right? The British were after these militants, and they were. It was like they were all around trying to sneak attack and do things like that. Yeah, Bill. Wow, amazing. So just to repeat a couple things Bill said. So one, he was just reminding that there were Jewish brigades as part of the British Armed Forces fighting against the Nazis, which is, yes, important to remember. And that, back to, I can't remember, Sunny maybe said that the British were warned by the Irgun and the High Commissioner, whoever just was the Lehi, the Stern Gang. Yeah. Okay, so just to continue on, because we've got like 2 more slides, we'll get there. So between all of this, revolt, basically the entire population was revolting against the British. The British decided they had enough. They were just like ready to pack up and leave. And so in 1947, they decided to hand the territory over to the United Nations and go home. This is where we get, of course, the partition plan that was voted on we're almost to the same date, the 29th of November, 1947, to basically partition so that the Jews would have the green areas, 55% of the land, and the Arabs would have 42% in the yellow, and Jerusalem, again, would be under the auspices of an international body. The Jewish leadership accept partition. You can see the crowds in the street celebrating when it was voted and approved by the UN. and the Arab leadership rejected it. And that launched what was not quite the War of Independence. It launched really like a civil war within Israel among the local Arabs and local Jews, and really with the Haganah fighting against the Arabs, and it was about 6 months of that kind of civil internal war. And then when the British Mandate officially formally ended on May 14th, 1948, that is when Ben-Gurion declared independence, the state of Israel, and it was the next day that turned from a civil war into a regional war of the surrounding countries, 5 countries, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, invading and fighting alongside the local Palestinian Arabs into the War of Independence. So that's where I want to stop, because I wanted to lead right up to this moment of the statehood. And the last thing I'll just share is, if you like historical fiction and you're interested in this time period, to watch on Netflix The Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, which is a wonderful, there's two seasons of it, and it takes place in multiple time periods of the generations of this family. So you get the late Ottoman period, and then you get this late British Mandate period. So you get a flavor of what it looked like and the costumes and everything like that, but also this history, and it's excellent. So that is where I'll end. Thank you all very much.
And this one's on. Thank you so much, Rabbi Brown. What an interesting time period, and has so many important implications for our days now, this time, and the kind of rhetoric that's going on and controversies, let alone what's happening in Israel. So thank you again so much. Thank you all so much for coming, and hope to see you next month for our Hanukkah party.